Okay, trying what I can about the sound. I'm working on it. I'm working on it. It's doing this thing to me again. Okay, how's that? Can you guys hear this? Okay, now there is sound? Or did I just wreck it again? Okay, we'll find out in a second. I'm changing some settings, so I don't know if that could be heard or not. Alright, but I changed settings after it started. But that seems to happen when I'm on the road. I don't have all of my usual equipment, but it looks like we're okay now. Hey Lisa, hey Gary, hey Perry, hey Ava. Okay, I've been saying good morning to everybody, I swear. And this is Lily, this is Lenora's cat, who is very cuddly but doesn't like to be picked up too much, it seems. Hey Marie. Hey Adam. Hey Phoenix. Hey Dina. Okay, so there's sound now, good. Hey Tracy, hey Laura. This is Lenora's cat, Lily, who's down here, getting fur all over my face. Hey, Susan. Hey, Susie. Hey, Bat. Hey, Bob. Hey, Timothy. Lenora's back behind me someplace. Hey, Kathleen. Here we go, Lily, here. Say hi to everybody. That's some good waving. Hey, Christy. She's very cuddly down here. Hey, Mary Lynn in Tacoma. Hey, Georgia. Good to meet you finally, too, Adam. And is the stars thing popping up? I don't know if that works when I go through Restream like this. I'm not at home today, so Miles has not met Lily. I'm sure Miles would like Lily, except that Miles would probably want to play rough and tumble with her. And I don't think that's really Lily's style. Okay. So when I broadcast through Restream instead of through Facebook itself, so I can get on the other stuff. It's a little different. I can't always see what you guys are seeing. Hey, Cindy. Phoenix, yeah, Stars gets me money, theoretically. I haven't gotten a payout from it yet, but... Stars is this new way to tip on live videos that Facebook came up with. And I'm fine just using PayPal and Venmo now that I got those back, but far be it for me to tell people how to send me money. Yes, I imagine there may still be some issues with the scrolling of the comments. That's been an issue with live Facebook video for the last couple of days. But it's more on Facebook's end.
Give our faithful seat a slap and carry on in jive. Hi-ho, Silver!
Good morning, Jan. Hey, Crit. Hey, Tony. Hi to everybody that I said good morning to and the sound wasn't working yet. Hey, Christine. Good morning, everybody. Bob, yeah, Miles will get a new playmate probably in early fall, probably as soon as possible. But we'll wait until after Aiden moves in for college. Morning, Lorena. Hey, Nippur. Morning again, Ava. Hey, Bridget. Well, if they're scammers and they're giving me money, I'm not that picky about who gives me money. But yeah, we're on the road again today. This should be my last time broadcasting from on the road for a little while anyway. Welcome along. Yeah, comments seem to be frozen for a lot of people. That's been happening with me when I watch other people's Facebook stuff as well. It's an issue somewhere on Facebook's end.
As long as we're driving out west here, well, let's stop and have a little Father Hines melody of the Colorado sunset. Jive.
Hey, Grandma Belle. I imagine when we do get a kitten, we'll go to pause as we always have, and all three of us will go into the room and see if a cat picks us. That's what we've always done in the past. We've always gotten such wonderful cats like that. Thanks, Aaron. Patty, yes, a few people are giving me stars. I can see how much I've got in my account. I'm just not sure when exactly they're going to convert it into currency. But I've got it all set up, so it shouldn't be an issue. Hey, Tato. Hey, Nina. Alright, we'll give it a couple more minutes. That's how we knew with Charlotte, that she was a little kitten. We went into the little room and she got right onto Ronnie's lap and went to sleep. And Miles climbed right onto me, then right into Aiden's hoodie. And did a lot of climbing. That's why he's named Miles after Miles Morales, the Brooklyn Spider-Man. Good morning, John. Good morning all around. Hey, Lisa. Happy anniversary, Carol.
With a bow to Rohe Harris for the words, we turn on now to the next tune. Earl Father Hines gives us a bit of jive under the general heading of So Help Me.
Morning, Peter in Naperville. Grandma Belle had a tuxedo cat for a long time. Toby, that cat was nuts. Morning, Linda. Alright, we'll give Earl Father Hines a couple more minutes. Yeah, maybe I'll try this looping video here. What makes the flag wave proud? Courage. Morning, Denise on YouTube. Well, yesterday's Graceland tour was still very hot. And I feel like I'm getting my sea legs back. These first couple of tours, I feel like the muscle memory of giving tours in person isn't coming back as much as I thought it was. But we're getting there. I am broadcasting from Lenora's place. There is a cat here named Lily who has already made an appearance. Yeah, Ben, that's what I do. I bust into people's houses and I broadcast via Facebook. Siri, sorry to hear you can't make it. Hey, Sarah. I was just gonna ask. Morning, Amy on YouTube. Yes, I'm gonna sneak into your house and I'm gonna make your cat a star. That's what I'm gonna do. We'll give it just another minute or so to listen to Earl Father Hines. She's probably picked something more pride appropriate. I could have picked some Duke Ellington. Billy Strayhorn, his chief arranger and composer, was a gay man, and Duke would not hear anybody criticizing it. Now, Timothy, I felt like it was coming back to me partway through Thursday. Beautiful Sunday to you, Marine. Hey, Ava.
Well, we're about
Hey, Eleanor.
through the jive concert by Earl Mies and his orchestra, so now it can be told it's reaching you from the new ground.
I hope Graceland got some rain yesterday, too. We were just getting on the road when it was coming in, and we managed to stay ahead of it. I don't know how much Chicago got, but it was coming there. But all right, everybody, welcome along once again. So, all right. Welcome, everybody. I'm Adam Saltzer from Mysterious Chicago, broadcasting to you live from the Eastern Time Zone today at my mother-in-law's place. If you watch carefully, you might see Lily the cat popping in at any given time. Miles is at home being played with by several other people. People just line up to come play with Miles if we're going to be out of town for 6 or 7 hours. But who can blame them? So, all right, I'm Adam Saltzer from Mysterious Chicago Tours. I've been a tour guide and historian here in Chicago for over 15 years now. I've got about a dozen Chicago history books out, including Mysterious Chicago and the now rare collector's item Ghosts of Chicago. And under the name S.J. Adams 10 years ago, in fact, we're right about at the 10-year anniversary of a book I did called Sparks, one of my favorite books that I ever wrote under the name S.J. Adams, which won a Stonewall honor in 2012, the year after it came out. So it's one of my proudest achievements as an author. So today's tour is one that I do every June. Well, I've done it twice now. This is all about Pride Month stories in Chicago cemeteries, and I was really thrilled to see this flag at Graceland Cemetery yesterday. But this one was I could just about do this just at Graceland, but I also want to include as many people as I can, so we're doing stuff from Chicago cemeteries all over the place. Now, of course, a lot of times I'm going to try to flag it when I'm doing this, but there's a lot of times when we're really just kind of guessing what we know of somebody's biography, what we know of somebody's style, things that they might have put in letters. Sometimes this broadly makes us think that people from the past might fit into the queer community, but a lot of times it's impossible to know for sure. Particularly, a lot of times we're wondering if they would fit into identities and terms that didn't exist in their time and communities that didn't exist back then. If they were born today, would they fit into it? Probably. It's one thing. Would they have fit into it if somebody told them about it back in their day when nothing in their experience prepared them for it? It's a whole other question. And same thing goes with some of the artwork. Like, we're going to let me jump outside of Chicago for just a little bit here and go back to Columbus, where we were last week for Find a Grave Friday at Green Lawn Cemetery. Is this awesome sarcophagus recently restored for Frederick Schumacher, who was an arts patron. And this fresco carving on it, I'm not really entirely sure what's going on. It's probably something from mythology. I couldn't find anything online, from a quick search at least, that explained it. But I couldn't fail to notice these women on the left-hand side. I'm sure you can come up with many explanations, like I'm sure they're just good friends, or the whole thing about the cult of Victorian romantic friendship. But you know what? Those explanations only go so far. But alright, so today what we are going to be doing is covering a lot of stories from a variety of Chicago cemeteries. Now, quite a number of them. I love these signs at Graceland. Hate has no home here. Well, there's some dead people here that were not the most loving or tolerant people, but they're dead now. You know, they have the sign waving here. Now, most years there are a number of graves at Graceland Cemetery that get pride flags planted on them, often by people's family or friends, and that's actually a very good way for me to find out about some of the people. Hasn't happened as much the last couple of years due to COVID or things, but I'm going to see what happens in the next week or so. But to start with our stories for today, we are going to pop out to the suburbs to Forest Home Cemetery for one of my favorites. I was so glad to find a marked grave for this person. That's a group family grave, really. But this is the grave of a woman by the name of Viola Larsen, who lived to a ripe old age, but back in the early 1900s, She was making the news quite a lot for stunts that led to her being referred to as Sensational Viola. You might recognize this headline from the new Mysterious Chicago shirt that has some of my favorite headlines. Girl steals rig to write about it. Now, Viola was arrested for stealing a horse and buggy, and told reporters in jail, that she did it because she was planning to write a book. And in writing the book, there was going to be somebody who steals something and goes to jail, and she had to get that authentic experience. Now, this is something that she herself, the term white privilege had not been coined by sociologists yet. Letters that she wrote to editors in the 1910s indicate that she probably would have figured out that this is something she would only get away with in her own personal circumstances. But she was inspired by a writer named Mary McLean, who we've also talked about quite a bit here. She comes up on the Gold Coast tour. She wrote a book as a teenager called I Await the Coming of the Devil that was absolutely terrific. What survives of Viola's writing is not quite as compelling as Mary's. It's really fun to read her comments on it. Sometimes she's talking about how she absolutely is a huge fan of Mary. Other times she says, well, I'm a genius too, but I'm not the same kind as Mary is. It's a whole different thing. I'm not really a big supporter of hers. She reminds me a lot of times in her early interviews and talks of like somebody that you would see on Tumblr who alternates between talking about how they really can't stand Taylor Swift with recording covers of Taylor Swift songs. But here's the thing, she got into these kind of fixes over and over again where she was getting in trouble for committing some sort of crime or plotting to commit a crime, and usually she would say she was doing it for the experience of writing about it, but a few newspapers also led on the fact that there was another angle sometimes. Often she was doing it to impress a girl that she had a crush on. There was even one instance where they recovered a letter she had written to this girl, saying, I sincerely hope you had a pleasant Christmas as in the past, etc. You are beautiful. I say this much even if I am a girl. Girls can admire as well as men. It's not a very good scan that I was able to get of this one, but really, there's a thing we talk about now and then called coding. Like, the newspapers wouldn't come out and say she was a lesbian, but they would say, leave little hints behind that that's what they thought was going on. I've never seen anybody, especially her age in her era, coded quite as clearly as a lesbian as Viola Larsen was at the time. Now, eventually, a newspaper paid her to write her autobiography. Not really in book form, just in a long article form, but I've got a couple of excerpts of it here. The autobiography of Viola Larsen begins with, Chapter 1, My Confession. To begin with, I am queer. People have always said so, and I don't dispute them. Chapter 2 begins with, Chapter 2, yes, I am queer. So, that's, on one way hand, this is the early 20th century. That wasn't really how she meant it. It didn't mean the same thing as we would mean today if we said that. On the other hand, yeah, she kind of did mean the same thing that we would mean if we said that today. Eventually, she did get married to a man, but not for very long. She would later say that she only married him so she would know what marriage was like so that she could write about it, but didn't really do a lot of writing. Other than the magazine articles and a couple of newspaper interviews, none of her writings were ever really published and don't really seem to survive. 1911, she made the news one more time for offering to sell her finger. Somebody needed a finger transplant. She offered to sell hers for $100 and was even like practicing to make sure she could still play piano without that finger. But nothing ever came of it. She had just gotten kind of addicted to that kind of publicity. But after this, she only made the news in terms of letters to the editor where she criticized racism and bigotry, kind of disappeared out of the news until 1936 when suddenly she won a Humane Medal. In the 1930s, and through the rest of her life for another 30 years after this, she became a dog rescuer. By the 1950s, she was known as Chicago's dog lady. She would go out every day with a net and a pistol, rescuing stray dogs. Here's a picture of her in older days with a couple of the dogs that she had rescued. Ended up winning Humane Medals. The articles about these never really referred to her past when she was known as Sensational Viola, and I really have to wonder what it would have been like if somebody asked her about it. Would she look back at all that stuff and laugh? Would she be horribly embarrassed to have said those sort of things? But here's the thing, she never remarried again, but as of the 1950 census, she is listed as living over in what is now the West Loop with a woman who was her roommate. Sure, roommate. But I love it. This is a story that actually had a happy ending, as far as we can tell. And there's probably still people around who remember Viola the dog lady, too. I haven't run into any of them yet, but I'm still hoping I'll meet somebody at one point. I did manage to get lucky enough to meet some people who knew one of my favorite people to talk about over here. This is out in Shalom Memorial Park. I thought I had some video of this grave, but it turned out I did not. But this is Nelis Rosenfeld, who during most of her time in Chicago in the early 1920s was known under another name. She changed her name quite a bit over the course of her life. But her name in the 1920s was Lillian Colley. She ran this building behind her called the Wind Blew Inn. And the Wind Blew Inn was a bohemian tea room. It was her attempt to recreate the kind of places they had in Greenwich Village in New York. It was a place where genius types hung out. It has generally been referred to now as an early LGBT hangout in Chicago, partly because of Lillian herself. Now, Lillian had a lot of different jobs besides running a tea room, where she was most certainly also selling booze under the table, this being the 1920s, and tea cost something like 75 cents there, which is an awful lot of money for a cup of tea in 1920. But she also had jobs like working as a reporter for the newspapers, where she would get jobs like working on a construction crew for a day. This is a picture of her that was just recently digitized from the Life magazine archives. There's also the Tribune has a picture of her working for the Sells Floto Circus, one of her other many side hustles. But mostly she was known for running the Wind Blew Inn. She kind of set the city on fire at the time. The cops used to raid the place all the time because of rumors that they were hosting petting parties. Not so much for the illegal liquor, but for the illicit makeout sessions. So finally, one night they arrested everybody, hauled them before a judge, and Lillian and a woman referred to as her partner in most articles, a woman named Virginia, went before the judge and said, "Your Honor, we solemnly swear there is no snuggle pupping at the Wind Blew Inn." And that's my favorite term, snuggle pupping. It's like a slightly more illicit and illegal form of cuddling. So the judge had kind of a sense of humor about the whole thing. He says, "The only thing the matter with you is that you have false ideas about the basic values of life," and sentenced them to read a book of fairy tales to cure them of their bohemian and feminist ideals. They read the fairy tales, but at least in Lillian's case, Virginia later went on to become a bank robber. We've generally speculated since then that Lillian and Virginia were probably more than just friends, but then they have had a major breakout, and Virginia, who was pictured here on the left, was the chief suspect when somebody set fire to the Wind Blew Inn in 1922. More or less went out of business after that. Whether they were actually more than friends is hard to know. I was actually able to get in touch with Lillian's son, who was born many years later. Lillian, I was so gratified to find out what happened to her. A couple of years after the Wind Blew Inn burned down, she gave a great interview about how flappers are not savages. They represent a new era of new opportunities for women. But then she just disappeared off of the record. Turned out she had changed her name a couple of times. She went and worked on Cannery Row in California for a while. Then she had a play that was produced on Broadway, wrote a couple of murder mystery novels, wrote a couple of more literary fiction novels. She and her son attended every play on Broadway from about 1950 to 1970, usually from the front row. She had a few more plays produced, hung out with Irene Castle, the actress who was her best friend. And this is Lillian in the 1970s. That's her son Frank on the right. And I asked him, "Do you know about anything to do with what her relationship with Virginia was?" And he said, I don't know for sure, but it's entirely possible that they might have been more than friends. And he went on to list a few other women from throughout her life that he strongly suspected she might have had an affair with. And further pointed out that he himself came out as gay in the 1970s, and it didn't bother her one little bit. That's her in 1976. I love that picture. She still looks spry. Spry is the perfect word here. But she wrote under the name Nelis Child. Rosenfeld was her husband's name. Nelis was based on her mother. Her mother's name was Nelly Lieberman. She changed her name to Nelis Child, which really was just a fast way of saying Nelly's child. Most of her books came out under that name. If you search around, you can find some of them. My favorite is she wrote an article for a book of Chicago murder stories that came out, which also had one of the early accounts of H.H. Holmes, and one of the first ones to use the suggestion that he may have killed as many as 200 people. For just one split second after I found out what became of her later, I thought maybe she wrote the H.H. Holmes article, and I was like, oh, come on. It was pretty close, though. Pretty close. Now we'll move on back to Graceland Cemetery here. And this one we talked about a little bit on the morning mini tour yesterday, where there's this magnificent underground mausoleum, currently for the Stevens family, built originally for the McGee family, till the son-in-law of Mr. McGee sold it off and had everybody hauled out and reburied. Class. But up on the top of that is the Roget Smith family marker. Now, missing from the marker is a name for a woman, a daughter of the family, who was cremated and scattered in the lake, named Mary Roget Smith, who is pictured here on the right. And on the left is her lifelong partner, Jane Addams of Hull House. Now, when we talk about historical figures in Chicago history that are thought to have been gay, Jane Addams is the one that probably comes up the most frequently. And once again, it's difficult to know the exact parameters of what their relationship would have been, but this is one we generally agree on. Well, the best line I've heard is one of Addams' biographers said, if you ask me, was Jane Addams a lesbian, I would say yes. If you ask me if she would identify with what we call a lesbian today, that might be a whole other question. That's kind of a good way of thinking about it, I think. There's a lot of times we're talking about styles of relationships that would have been unfamiliar to people. We're talking about terms that didn't exist at the time, identities that hadn't really been codified in those days. There's actually quite a number of people where I can make a good guess as to how they might identify today, but it's hard to know for sure. For instance, elsewhere in Graceland Cemetery, there is an unmarked space, but we can identify where it is because it's close to this cylindrical grave. But she specifically wanted to be buried with no marker, no ceremony, nothing. It was a woman by the name of Mary Hastings Bradley. Mary Hastings Bradley was an adventurer and explorer. A guidebook she wrote about exploring in Africa was a major source for Teddy Roosevelt when he went on his own expedition. And according to her daughter, had many lovers, not all of whom were men. I don't really know how to classify her exactly, but her daughter, Alice, went on to have a long and fruitful career as a science fiction author under the name James Tiptree Jr. And James Tiptree was her alias, her pseudonym, from the content of many of her letters. It was a closely guarded secret in sci-fi for years. Only a couple of people, even people who corresponded back and forth with James for years, had any idea about the identity behind the author. Some of her letters make me strongly suspect that if she were alive today, hadn't died 30 or 40 years ago, she might identify as transgender or non-binary or gender fluid. But without her still being here now, it's impossible to know. Another one that's one of those ones that in the 21st century it seems fairly obvious, and this is on almost all of my Graceland tours. It's such a magnificent mausoleum and also such a magnificent story. Designed by Louis Sullivan, this is the Getty family monument, built for Henry and Carrie Getty in the 1800s. Henry worked in the Ryerson steel industry. Mr. Ryerson himself had also had Louis Sullivan design a mausoleum for him. So inside here, though, is their daughter, Alice. Now, Alice grew up partially in the Paris Bohemian sect, or the Paris intellectual sect, while also dividing her time between Chicago and Muskegon. Always maintained a lot of Chicago connections. But after her mother died, she and her husband went traveling around and collecting art. Eventually, she decided to become a composer and was fairly successful at that. Some of her sheet music was published in the Chicago Tribune. I actually had a friend record it for an episode of Cemetery Mixtape. But then she switched gears. By some accounts, actually became a Buddhist, and by others, just became really interested in Buddhist art. She wrote a book called The Gods of Northern Buddhism, their history and progressive evolution across the northern Buddhist countries, which is still in print. It's considered a really authoritative academic work on historical Buddhist art. During World War I, she switched gears again for a little bit and started a Braille printing press for soldiers who had been blinded in the war. In the 1920s, after her father died, she went to Japan to live in a monastery with an obscure Buddhist sect that is still not that well understood. She wrote a manuscript about her time there, but before it could be published, she was living in France in the 1930s when the Nazis took over the village and are thought to have destroyed the manuscript. So, fleeing from Europe, she came to New York, where she lived out the rest of her days studying the Syrian goddess of love, Ilana, and living with a woman who was officially referred to as her study partner. Never married, just had a long-term study partner. which in the 21st century gives us certain ideas. And again, we don't, I like to flag that we don't know for sure, but certainly around the office in Graceland, we'll be looking at the records like, But now for a few that we know about a little bit better. Well, Edith Rockefeller McCormick is not one of these stories. It's just where the video starts. Move up around over here. Around the pond at Graceland is a spot that is should be marked soon, as I understand it, but is presently not, for a guy by the name of David Lee Hull. He was a Northwestern philosophy professor. He was a pioneer of the field of the philosophy of biology. Some of his text and the papers that he wrote on the philosophy of biology are still considered relevant after 60 years, which is really pretty unusual in academia. But towards the end of his life, in the 1990s and early 2000s, when people asked him about his old academic stuff, he would say, boring, and was focusing a lot more on writing about his experiences as a gay man in Chicago in the mid-20th century. In particular, he talked about there were only 2 bars that he knew of, or at least that he hung out in the 1950s. They were located right about here where Clark Bar was recently, right by the site of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in this little space up on North Clark Street. But there were 2 of them. There was one called Volleyballs, which was a lesbian bar, and the Scarlet Ribbon, which was for gay men. The way he described it was they were separated by like a swinging saloon door. Then the Scarlet Ribbon would be full of guys dancing their heads off, and Volleyballs would be 6 women getting in a fight. Place was raided by the police fairly regularly. Now, in the 1980s, his partner was one of the first AIDS casualties in the city, and he was just stunned with how poorly the guy was treated. They wouldn't even tell him what he had for a while until a doctor let it slip. When he knew that he was dying, said, should I arrange to donate my body to science? The doctor just callously said, they don't take AIDS patients. So he eventually turned his own home into sort of a hospice for people who were dying of AIDS. At times it got to be very crowded towards the late 80s and early 90s. One person who knew him said he was only 5'2", but the biggest man that I ever met. And when the AIDS crisis started to get more manageable, and you started being, if you were a gay man in the late 1990s, you were probably getting invited to 500 funerals a year. Then it got down to about 20 to 50 funerals a year. After that, there were far fewer people in his house, but his stamina had kind of been worn out by then. So his grave is presently unmarked, but they're working on it. I think his family and friends are working on something for that. But we'll move on a little bit more to some other people that we know a little bit better. Just here in Graceland Cemetery. Ludwig Mies van der Rohe here is probably not one of them. But right over here is a guy that we talked about a little bit yesterday on the in-person tour. This is one of them that I actually like doing better a little bit virtually, so I can show better examples of his work. This is an architect by the name of Bruce Gough. Now, in the 1950s, your average architect was building a lot of plain black rectangles, the modernist school. Bruce Gough was designing things like this, or like this. And on this one, if you look really closely on this, you can see a lot of bits of blue bits of what is called cullet, the remains of what comes out of a glass bending oven. And some of it is now on top of his gravestone. He loved to build with cullet, at a time when most people were just doing steel and glass. I really love this one, too. This is a bachelor pad that he designed. So, of course, it's a bachelor pad. The New York Times recently referred to his work as gloriously disobedient. Now, in fact, recently there was a retrospective of his work was on display at the University of Oklahoma, which I think is kind of make things right a little bit. They were the same university that fired him back in the 50s after they found out that he was gay. Well, let's move over from Bruce just a bit. The next one over is a guy by the name of John Cockrell, another early AIDS victim in Chicago. Now, John got his start as an interior designer, but in his 30s, he got more into things like furniture design, and finding examples of his design that were well photographed was something I had a bit of trouble with, but here's John with a table that he designed. He mostly continued to make his money in interior design, but his furniture was really taking off at the time of his death. We certainly see this sort of thing with artists a lot. It's one of the common threads among historical people that we at least strongly suspect may have been gay, is a lot of them do seem to be artists. For instance, not too far away from Bruce and John, on the northern end of Graceland, is this statue by Nelly Vern Walker. She was a Laredo Taft protege, and not much of her personal life is really known, but we know that she never married and was quoted as saying that I've never met a man who would interest me as much as my work does. Also, there are a lot of biographers at least strongly suspect that Louis Sullivan, whose grave is right here past the monument to the Kimball family. Let me speed this up a bit. We'll pass the Kimballs. Louis Sullivan had one brief unhappy marriage. I don't know all of the details of it, but biographers strongly suspect today that he may have been gay. We don't really know for sure. There's another one. Sometimes it gets kind of weird even trying to figure these things out, because I feel like we're just kind of like seeing who fits all of the stereotypes. For instance, back at Forest Home, not far from Viola Larsen, is one of only 2 mausoleums that I know of in Chicago that are built specifically for a woman and contain no adult men. This one for Grace P. Carr. Now, we don't know too much about Grace P. Carr. I suspect that her mausoleum came from the fact that when she died, she left all of her money to her employers in the 1930s. And their employers probably felt weird about it and decided to spend it all on building her a mausoleum. She's also not that well documented a person, but we know that she died in the 1930s. She was unmarried and died on a fishing trip, which is about the most stereotypical way for a lesbian in the 1930s to die. But that's all I really know. Similarly, up here at the Lyon family monument, now John Lyon, the trader, was probably the Board of Trade trader, was probably the best known of these people, but he also had a brother named Billy Lyon, who was more known as a clubman. He also worked at the Board of Trade, but it was just strictly a day job to him, whereas to John it was a total passion. Billy was more interested in hanging out with actors and artists. Never married, told people that a man who loves club life and the theater as much as I do has no right to get married. It's one of those things where in the 21st century we fill in the blanks a little bit more. Over elsewhere in Graceland, now, when we talk about the Newberry family, we usually talk about the old rumor that Mr. Newberry was buried in a barrel of rum. And it's kind of half true. His body, after he died at sea, his body was preserved in a barrel of rum until they made it to France, at which point they transferred him to a proper casket to be shipped back home. But he had a daughter who is not buried in the cemetery. She died while she was in Europe. But a daughter by the name of Julia. That's her on the right, I think. But this is a couple of her books were published. One was just her diary and one was her sketchbook called The Life of Two Future Old Maids. Julia and her cousin had this whole plan where they were never going to marry, they were just going to set up housekeeping together. There was a quote here, "My cousin Minnie Clapp and I, Julia R. Newberry, have long since decided that we will never marry but be 2 jolly old maids and live in a house of our own. We do not expect to be at all melancholy, but to give balls, dinners, and every sort of entertainment except tea fights." I don't know what a tea fight is offhand, but I'm looking that up right after this. "We shall be happy to receive visits from all our friends, young and old bachelors, married and unmarried ladies. Everybody except children, which we respectively request must be left behind." Now, to say that this is evidence that she was a lesbian, just from this kind of imagining, is probably a little bit of a stretch, except for the fact that Minnie Clapp's daughter was Tracy Mygat. You can see her name down at the bottom here. She was the one who brought this book out. And she and her partner, Frances Witherspoon, who were well-known social activists and war resistors in their day, are also generally believed to be early examples of lesbian writers and activists of the 1920s. Moving back on a little bit. Now, starting in like 1990s and late 80s gravestones, you do start to see these ones where we know a little bit better. This is a Graceland. There's quite a few different gravestones that have this same marker, partners in life. Now, the board might have been weird in the early 90s when they first probably bought these about having it say husbands, because that wasn't legal at the time. In this case, they were William and Richard. And Richard was the first male kindergarten teacher in Evanston. William, his partner, was the academic vice president of the Newberry Library. Were partners for something like 40 years and married for 7. Right near them are a couple of other things. There's another one, Randy Scott Johnson and David W. Schlischmann, a couple of artists who lived in Pullman. It's about all I know about them, as they talked in some interviews about moving to Pullman where they could afford to be artists a little bit better. I believe both of them were AIDS casualties as well. We'll get off topic just a little bit to move a little bit beyond these two to one that I just like pointing out. But there is some connective tissue between the next story. Is right near them is a cenotaph. That's a marker for somebody who's not actually buried there, for John Weir, born in Scotland, lost at sea April 14th, 1912, SS Titanic. Now, what a marker for him is doing in this family's plot is a bit of a mystery in and of itself. He's in the Graham family plot. I can't find any connection between him and the Grahams, but it's one of two Titanic cenotaphs in Graceland Cemetery. The other is over here. This is, well, first of all, Arthur Ryerson, nephew of the Ryerson steel guy. No, he's some kind of weird, I can't remember how the family connection worked between them and Ryerson Steel. Them and Ryerson Lumber. This is the Ryerson Steel Ryersons. But next to Arthur, who was lost on the Titanic, is his sister Eleanor. This is also a cenotaph because she is buried in Massachusetts. Probably in the same cemetery as the woman that she lived with for most of her life. There was a thing in those days called a Boston marriage. A Boston marriage was when two women set up housekeeping together. In most cases, we would assume today that they were probably lesbians. In Eleanor's case, it was quite literally in Boston that she set up housekeeping with a best friend who had come to visit her several times in Chicago, according to newspaper references of parties. She would throw parties for this friend of hers quite a bit, then eventually just went to live with her. Neither of them ever married. They just remained in housekeeping by themselves. If we walk the other way from John Weir, we come to another one in Chicago that we actually know a little bit better for sure. Right up here is the Meeker family, big Prairie Avenue family in Chicago. In fact, Arthur Jr. wrote a whole book about life on Prairie Avenue, though he barely would have remembered it, really. But Arthur Meeker Jr. on the left with his mother Grace Murray Meeker, who could always be counted on to reminisce about Gilded Age Chicago. But Arthur became a travel writer himself and also a novelist, and is one of the ones of Chicago history we know from his letters that he was gay. He had a partner that he lived with for many years. It's another one of his contemporaries. I'll move just a little bit away from the Ryersons here. This is a bit of a hike. I'll speed this one up too. Over here is the Allerton family plot for Samuel Allerton, the founder of the Union Stockyards. Now, eligible to be buried here, but had his ashes scattered, was their son, Robert Allerton. Now, Robert Allerton was not allowed to marry his partner. He had set up housekeeping with a man. A judge would not allow them to get married, but allowed him to adopt his partner, which many people now believe renders them the first legally recognized same-sex couple. And anecdotally, I've heard from several people that was, in the early and mid-20th century, that was a trick that a lot of gay couples employed, was one of them would adopt the other to get them on the benefits. I haven't seen too much actual evidence of that happening with other people. I'm sure it did. But these were the first. There's paperwork about it still on file at Graceland's. They didn't end up being buried here. Their ashes were scattered in Hawaii. But they were eligible to be buried in this plot. And just beyond them is probably the first marked grave for a same-sex couple that was put up in Graceland Cemetery back in the 1980s. Move on just a little bit from this. It's this very nice one with the urn for Goodall and Harris. And these men were long-term partners. Goodall worked for the Civic Opera Company. And on the marker down below is a line from Tosca, which translates to, "I lived for art, I lived for love, I never hurt a living soul." Both died in the 1980s. I'm not sure if it was AIDS. I kind of assume it was. One where I know a little better is over at Rose Hill Cemetery. One of their marked graves is for Seawold and DePaulo. And this was a gay couple. DePaulo actually designed the monument to the two of them. And there was some reminiscing about them in Windy City Times. Somebody wrote a letter saying, "Does anybody remember these guys?" And the main thrust of it was that they were hilarious to hang around with. Both very funny guys. And there's others that I just don't really know a thing about other than what I can find in a short obituary or something like that. Like back at Graceland, is this one for Lester A. Sabo, who was an AIDS casualty in 1994, beloved friend of Scott. All we know about him from his obituary is that he was a Vietnam veteran. There's also, I had to linger on the coyote crossing the road here for this one first. But there's this shared marker with a peace sign for Joseph Cantagallo and Robert Toira. I don't know about, all I really know about them, though, is just that they have a shared marker like this. And nearby them is Ron Rice and Rick Brown, partners in life. And James Ray Scarborough, who, I think what I was able to find from the obit was it mentioned somebody who was his dear friend. They were always kind of coy about this thing in obituaries, even in the late 80s, early 90s. And just over in the shadow of all of these, of the pond, the one that I just kind of happened to notice was another cenotaph for a guy by the name of Roger Brown, who was an artist beginning in the 1970s. To the left is his partner George, who was lost to AIDS in the 1980s. But Roger Brown was an artist. This is one of his works from the 70s called Rising Above It. Another one that he designed, one I've got a bigger one of. This is Christ's Entry into Chicago by Roger Brown. I love this. They've got like Jesus arriving on a flatbed truck, like giving a personal public appearance. It reminds me, there was I can't remember which comedian it was back in the 90s, who fantasized about Jesus coming back and going on tour, the opening announcement, and now the King of Beers brings you the King of Kings. And here you can see also stylized versions of the Hancock Building, the Aon Building, the Sears Tower off to the right, Chase Tower to the left of that, Mises IBM Building, very stylized version of the Chicago Tribune Tower, Michigan, and Water Tower Place beside that, and buildings that all look like the bridges. This is a great picture. I can just look at this and keep noticing new things. Here's Roger himself with his dog Elvis. And right nearby them was another one, Alan Sake and James Hammond. And one other to cover, just briefly. This woman comes up on so many of the tours. Over in the Medill family plot is Mr. Medill's granddaughter, Sissy Patterson, whose biographies these days generally focus a lot more on her many, many lovers that she had, that more than her career as a newspaper editor, or her period when she was actually a countess. Mostly they talk about her lovers and some wild and lurid stories. She is estimated to have over 200 of them, not all of whom were men. Need I say more? But all right, everybody, I wasn't sure that this broadcast was even going to work today with the Wi-Fi and everything and being on the road. You never can tell when you're on the road. Here's the house where Sissy was a girl down in the Gold Coast. We just saw that on the tour a couple of weeks ago. But all right, I want to plug some of the upcoming stuff that we've got coming up around here. I'm going to be back broadcasting from home again pretty soon here. My ramblings of the last couple of months are coming to an end. So Thursday night, we'll be back for another virtual tour called The Underground Railroad and Refugee Enslaved People in Chicago. It's one of my favorite tours to give. We're always finding out new things to add to it. Then, of course, on Saturday is going to be in-person tour day for a while. We're still trying to figure out how to start merging in-person tours back in now that the business license is through and they're being more allowed again. So Saturdays will tie into that. We'll be doing the Underground Railroad virtual tour, covers stuff from all around the city, but a lot of these people ended up at Graceland Cemetery. So Saturday morning will be Graceland the Underground Railroad, one that I've never done in person before. It's a little more walking than your average Graceland tour because these guys are scattered quite a ways about, but I'm really excited to be doing that one. And Sunday morning, the virtual tour a week from today will be Mansions and Mysteries in Chicago's River North, one that I've only done once before. I'm excited to try that one again. This is Luca. If you want to be cool like they are, you just need a Mysterious Chicago hoodie like they're wearing right here. But there's also Mysterious Chicago t-shirts, infant creepers, flasks, shot glasses, coffee mugs, including some with a headline about Viola Larsen on them now. Just go to cafepress.mysterious.com/mysteriouschicago. They will hook you up with everything you need. And once again, thanks a lot for joining me, everybody. I'm Adam Saltzer from Mysterious Chicago. I will put the Earl Father Hines back on, and we will just hang out for a while. So thanks a lot for coming, everybody. I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago Tours, and here's Father Hines.
Are gaily dancing here in the cool atmosphere to this jive of Earl Father Hines. Yeah, but now comes the Rohe Harris to sing Now It Can Be Told.
Luca is my sister's kid. Thanks, everybody, and happy Pride.
Now it can be told, old in all its glory. Now that we have met, the world
I should rewind the Earl to something a little bit livelier here. Thanks, Kathy. Thanks, Betty. Lisa, that book that just had its 10th anniversary is Sparks by under the name S.J. Adams. It's about a full house-obsessed girl who embarks on a holy quest with a couple of people who've invented their own religion in an effort to get over a huge crush on her best friend. A John Hughes-esque story. It sold about 6 copies, but it won an award, and it's one of my favorite of my books. Well, any idea why the mausoleum had its entrance bricked over? Probably the door was falling apart. Often when mausoleums aren't in great shape structurally, cemeteries will take that step of bricking it over. Especially if, like, Grace probably had no descendants, and probably had nobody to pay for the upkeep. Dina asks, what does SJ stand for? SJ stood for Satan Jehoshaphat, if anybody asked. But there was an Adam Saltzer book coming out the same day as that one. So I felt I should go with an alias, because it might just confuse people. If I'd known how little they were going to be promoting the one that came out under my name that day, I might have been tempted not to.
Well, let's stop and have a little
Why Knock on the Door was a special book for me. Really, I just read it in high school and it knocked me on my ass. What makes someone eligible to be buried at Graceland? You just have to buy a plot. At one point, Play Me Backwards was going to be an S.J. Adams book as well. That didn't end up being necessary. The fishing trip, really you just picture somebody out on a fishing trip dressed in flannel like your most stereotypical lesbian. The one that came out on the same day as Sparks was called Extraordinary, which is maybe my weirdest book. It's called Extraordinary, the true story of my fairy godparent who almost killed me and certainly never made me a princess. Really long subtitle. I wanted to call it Fairy God Mofo, but they wouldn't let me. Or certainly the full version of that word. But that's still what it says on my file. My word file still says fairy godmother effer. Thanks, Connie.
Harris for the words. We turn on now to the next tune. Earl Father Hines gives us a bit of jive under the general heading of So Help Me.
Dana, Aiden is spending a little more time with his dad's place, where his friends are there for the summer, but he's going to be moving in permanently for college pretty soon. So I don't have a date on any of that stuff yet. Oh yeah, the flannel thing's just an old school stereotype. Oh, thanks, Bob. Oh, Betsy, that's interesting. Thanks. Till tomorrow, Bob. Yes, George, I will recommend he take the train. He'll be taking the train a lot when he's in Chicago. He's going to be taking the train to school quite a bit. It won't be a Pullman car. That's just not a practical option right now. Have a great day, Betsy. Take the A Train. That was by Billy Strayhorn. Perhaps the best known Duke Ellington show, but it was a Duke Ellington tune, but Billy Strayhorn wrote it for him.
Concert by Earl Father Hines and his orchestra, so now it can be told it's reaching you from the new Grand Terrace on Chicago's south side, where the couples are gaily dancing here in the cool atmosphere.
What would I recommend you read first? Of my young adult novels, my favorite one, honestly, is Play Me Backwards.
Rohe Harris to sing Now It Can Be Told.
That's the most recent one. It's also my favorite. The rest of them, I think, a lot of them are just kind of period pieces now. They're a style of young adult literature that no longer really even exists. Well, YA humor died after Twilight. It never came back. No, I mean, am I totally out of the game yet of Kid Lit yet? I've been thinking I was, but I may not be. Oh yeah, if you want one that ties in with this stuff, Just Kill Me. I guess that's actually more recent than Play Me Backwards. Just Kill Me is all about a ghost tour guide who makes places more haunted by killing people at them.
Be told,
yeah, this is the third remote place I've been broadcasting from. I was at Jessica and Jeff's house in Iowa. I was at Aiden's dad's house just last week. That seems like a long time ago. And today I'm at Lenora's house. I should probably go find Lily again, see if Lily wants to make one more appearance before I log off. Hey, Lily? Is it me? Hey, Lily, you want to come? Yeah, everybody, this is Lily. She's not wild about being carried. But, okay. She loves to cuddle, but she doesn't love to be picked up very much. So now she's rubbing all up against me.
Softly, the tropic breeze is blowing, rise with love light glowing, beside a moonlit stream. Faintly, the waterfall is singing.
Well, Kathleen, have you read Lindsay Curry's book, Scritch Scratch? That's a good one. It's a good middle grade mystery. And pretty much based on me. Now, Lily is a lovely girl, aren't you, Lily?
Then why can it last forever, darling? The river murmurs sweetly that you are mine completely.
Hey, Lily, say hi to all the people. Say hi to the nice people. Thanks, Ava. Enjoy. Thanks, Timothy. Lily went all pixelated. Lily, did you get all pixelated? Alright, well, if we're getting all pixelated, that's probably time for me to take the cue and check off. We got quite some traveling in front of us today. But once again, a quick plug for the upcoming tours. And for cafepress.com/MysteriousChicago. Thursday night will be the Underground Railroad and Refugee Slaves in Chicago. That's one of my favorite ones to do. We will tie that in on an in-person tour on Saturday, Graceland Cemetery, the Underground Railroad. Quite a lot of the tight-knit community of abolitionists in Chicago ended up at Graceland Cemetery. There's a couple of theories as to why, but we're going to cover as many of them as I can cram into one walking tour on Saturday morning. Tickets are available for that one. Just go to MysteriousChicago.com. That'll hook everything up for you. And Sunday morning, a week from today, we're back with another virtual edition of Mansions and Mysteries in Chicago's River North. So, all right, everybody, once again, thanks a lot for joining me. I am Adam Saltzer of Mysterious Chicago Tours saying stay safe, stay proud, and of course, stay spooky. Thanks a lot, everybody.